Welcome back to This Week in Immigration, our in-depth look at what really mattered this week in immigration policy. I'm Jordan Lapierre.
And I'm Hunter Hallman. On the podcast this week, DACA's place in the congressional budget talks, the Trump administration's new refugee rules, and a roundup of the current legal cases on immigration.
You can subscribe to this podcast and all of BPC's podcasts on iTunes, or stream on our website at bipartisanpolicy.org.
And while you're there, you can find more information about all the topics we discuss on the podcast. Just go to bipartisanpolicy.org/immigration.
So let's start today with what's happening on DACA in Congress. I want to welcome in Laura Hall from BPCAction and Theresa Brown, as always, BPC's Director of Immigration and Cross-Border Policy. Hi to both of you.
Hello.
Hi.
So one of the things we're hearing a lot this week, Laura, is that a DACA fix might get attached to a government funding bill at the end of the year.
Yep.
Congress has to act to fund the government after, I think, December 15th is when the current agreement expires.
Right.
So you're the legislative expert here. How does Congress go about attaching bills like the DREAM Act or some other kind of DACA fix to a spending bill?
Sure. Well, let me back up a little bit and just kind of give a lay of the land where we are right now. Earlier this year, they kind of reached a continuing resolution to continue funding the government at the current levels through early December. Congress has to act on both the spending bills and raising the debt ceiling in order to be sure we don't go into a government shutdown. No one wants that, so there's been a lot of chatter about kind of moving forward with some kind of spending bill before December. That's usually kind of a must-pass vehicle, so there's always lots of talk about what other things can be added onto that vehicle that are also priorities for the administration, for congressional leaders, etc. And that's kind of where we're hearing DACA thrown into the mix. There's a lot of appetite in Congress, I think, to do something for this population. So the idea is adding it on to the spending bills, which kind of have to move forward anyway, would be a good place to address this issue as well.
So is the thinking here like eat your spinach and your cookies at the same time?
I mean, that's one way to put it, maybe.
Which is the spinach and which is the cookies?
Well, I'll leave that open
That's the
to
question.
interpretation.
Yeah, I mean, there's a lot of things that have been kind of tossed about is being added onto this end of the year. There's a fix for kind of the Obamacare that's been kind of negotiated between Senators Alexander and Murray. There's talk of renewing the children's health insurance program has expired. There's talk about adding that onto the end of the year. I think in all of our conversations on the Hill, there's a real appetite to do something for this population of kids, basically, that have now become adults and that are here. I think it's just figuring out how to tackle that issue. You know, there's been chatter about, do we want to add a component on securing the border to this? You know, is there a clean bill? Is that the best way of moving forward? I think that answer changes every day. It depends on who you talk to.
So who are the decision makers in this process? Is it down to Paul Ryan, Speaker Ryan, and Leader McConnell in the Senate as to whether DACA gets attached to a spending bill?
Ultimately, they determine what goes to the floor with input from their caucus and others. They don't want to bring something to the floor that's going to fail. So there's a lot of factors at play. I think the Democrats have played a large role. There was that meeting at the White House between Trump and Schumer and Pelosi, where they kind of hammered out the contours of what could be a deal. There's been a lot of pushback on that since that happened, so it's unclear if that moves forward. I think Paul Ryan in the House it has to pay attention to the more conservative wing of his party. They don't want a spending bill, or any spending bill that moves forward, they only would approve with offsets. They're kind of more budget hawks, so if anything moves forward without offsets, he might lose that wing of his party and have to pull in Democrats in order to get something across the finish line. So if I'm Paul Ryan, I'm thinking of all those factors. Mitch McConnell's got a different scenario. He's got a budget bill, a spending bill has to get 60 votes for it to move forward. He can't do that with Republicans alone. So I think hopefully anything that moves forward at the end of the year realistically is going to have to be a bipartisan solution.
You know, we've been talking a lot over the last few weeks about the policy and what policies could be part of a deal for Dreamers and Dockers, whether it's border security or other type of enforcement. Mm-hmm. When you add that package to the end of the year appropriations and funding the government, as you can tell by the other issues that Laura brought up, it now becomes a multi-dimensional kind of chess game. And the deal may not just be about DACA or Dreamers for immigration enforcement or border enforcement. It may be between that and offsets for some of these other things, or funding the Obamacare subsidies or something else. Those kind of decisions become very complicated and very political. What we would like to see, I think, is that the parameters of whatever the dream deal is going to look like are hammered out in a bipartisan way early, so that it's less likely that that becomes part of that bigger bigger discussion.
Like
it's already
debate,
done.
yep.
People have agreed on it. It's not going to cost or gain votes on the bigger appropriation. It can easily be added. That would be the ideal situation here, I think, from our perspective.
Yep, I think so.
So what's our current thinking on how this process might play out for DACA?
I think I touched on it a little. I think it's looking like an end of year play regardless. I think there was some talk earlier that, maybe they could get this done sooner. There's a focus on tax cuts. There's a bunch of other things that they're kind of working on right now. It seems that the moment for this is going to be the end of the year. I think I do see it kind of getting put into a larger package. As Theresa mentioned, it'd be nice if the DACA piece was kind of a self-contained thing, whatever that might be, whether it's DACA and some kind of border security component, whatever that is. I think we're still kind of figuring out what the parameters that might be, but that is an entity kind of attached on an omnibus spending bill.
It's probably pretty clear that nothing on DACA or DREAM is going to go through what's called regular order. It's not going to go through the committee process at this point in time. It's not going to have a separate floor vote, primarily just because there's not enough time.
Right.
So the prospects of it being a standalone bill at this point are small.
I think they're small. I mean, I think there's still a constituency pushing for that, and but just if you look at the clock and the calendar alone, that would be a pretty tough lift.
Are there some advantages to pursuing this approach, Theresa? Why might Republicans find this to be a more attractive option?
Well, I think there's a couple of things. Certainly for Democrats, their leverage, if you will, in negotiating something is higher on an end of year appropriations for precisely the reasons that Laura suggested. All of these other fiscal issues would likely cost some Republican votes, meaning that the leaders will need some Democratic votes just to get the whole thing over the finish line, and that increases their ability to insist on certain things being attached. On the flip side, for Republicans, I think it's to their advantage to try to deal with the Dreamers and DACA issue this year, in part because the longer it drags out, the more you're going to see the situation of the Dreamers themselves deteriorate, right? They're going to start losing employment authorization. They'll start losing the protections from deportation. There'll probably be some high profile cases of people being deported, none of which will, I think, play well for Republicans. And frankly, the closer you get to an election year next year, it would be better for them to have dealt with it ahead of time.
So it sounds like you're saying there's support on both sides of the aisle for this kind of deal.
I think there's support on both sides of the aisle for a deal, and I think there's a lot of support for trying to get it done as soon as possible.
Yeah, I'm optimistic that something can happen this year.
And what's the latest on the contours of this deal? Have there been any new wrinkles added into the process, or do we still think that what we've discussed the last couple of times we talked about this is still largely the way this deal plays out?
Well, I think the parameters are still being worked out. I think, as Laura said, there are a lot of Democrats who are still hopeful that it can be a clean dream fix, that there won't be trade-offs on enforcement. I think Republicans are still insistent there'll be some sorts of enforcement. There were some indications earlier today by some of those involved in the Republican conversations in the Senate and the House that certain things may not be part of the package, like, for example, E-Verify, that may not be part of this package. And then there are other things that we still don't know whether they might be part of the package, like gang-related provisions that Senator Flake introduced on his bill, or other types of interior enforcement. So I think it's still being discussed and determined, and we don't yet know.
Okay, thanks to you both.
Now let's turn to the Trump administration's new refugee rules. I'll welcome back Theresa Brown and also welcome policy analyst Cris Ramon to the conversation. Theresa, the Wall Street Journal and others are reporting that the Trump administration will allow refugee admissions to the U.S. now that its 3-month ban on refugee entries has ended. However, the Journal's report suggests that the administration will be adopting new vetting rules for refugees from 11 countries. Do we know which countries are going to be impacted by this?
So to again provide context, we remember that in Travel Ban 1, there was a ban on all refugees from Syria and a temporary ban for 120 days for all refugees from everywhere. That travel ban was enjoined by the courts. There was a second travel ban that was also stopped by the courts. The Supreme Court allowed that to go through, so Travel Ban 3.0 was issued that just dealt with the visa section. Now we have the final on the refugees. And what this proclamation says is that refugees from all countries can be welcomed. All will face some additional scrutiny. And there are a list of countries. The list is not a public list, although some people have found it through leaks, so I'm not going to go through the list. But there is a list of countries that already is subject to a higher level of scrutiny called a security advisory opinion. This process has existed in our immigration and visa process for decades. It was expanded and heightened after 9/11. The security advisory opinion process basically is an interagency process that allows various parts of the government, including law enforcement and intelligence agencies, to provide information that may be relevant to a visa or refugee applicant. So what the latest refugee proclamation says and the directives say is that if you are subject to one of these security advisory opinions, that process is going to be enhanced a little bit. Other agencies may be involved, and that no refugee can be admitted from the countries until that process is complete. So that's what some of the additional vetting is. In addition, all refugees are probably going to face some requests for more information, longer histories of where they have lived and worked and studied, more information about their extended family members, things like their social media profiles and email addresses going back, prior phone numbers. All of this is data that can be used to help determine if there's potential connections to people that we have concerned about or groups that we have concern about.
So let's drill down a little bit. If I'm a refugee from one of these 11 countries seeking to come to the United States, how will the process be different for me 3 months from now than it was 3 months ago?
The first thing that you will probably notice is that you'll get requested for this additional information. To go back a little further to get more information, again, that information request is the first thing that you'll see. And after providing that information, you may wait a little bit longer. Right now we know the average processing time for refugees can be as long as 18 to 24 months. That processing time may grow. The other thing that was determined is that because this advisory process for these countries could be longer, the government is actually going to redirect resources to people not from those countries to go faster. So that will even further delay this group of people from getting in. Again, most of the countries on the list, I would say, are from the Middle East or North Africa. They are mostly majority Muslim countries, although it should be said that refugees from those countries very often are religious minorities within those countries. For example, we know that Iranian refugees that we have admitted to the United States for the most part have been Christian. So it's not about being Muslim or not, it's about the country. So that's worth knowing and understanding as well.
Do other countries take similar steps to vetting their refugees, or is this sort of an outlier approach?
So I think the thing to understand is, from a comparative perspective, that I think we definitely have more stringent standards than I think you would see in other countries, either in the EU or in Canada. I think, especially with the duration of time. I think it's important to understand, though, I think that in the debate about our refugee policies is that obviously we're not in close proximity to the Middle East. And I think when you were hearing discussions about European refugee and migration policies, I think people lost that they were, a mass exodus of people coming from places like Syria and crossing into the EU. So as a result, I think that when you're thinking about that perspective of refugee flows into Europe, and then sort of thinking, well, is it the same way in the United States? It's no, not at all. Obviously we had issues related to unaccompanied children coming up, but I think that was very distinct from what we are calling the refugee crisis and how that's impacted Europe.
Yeah, refugees for the most part are not admitted. All of the screening vetting gets done before they ever come to the United States, and that's an important distinction that Cris makes. One other piece of information that's relevant from the new refugee orders is that if a refugee does not come in with their family when they first arrive, they are allowed to petition the government to bring the rest of their family with them. It's called so-called following to join. That's a small number of refugees who aren't admitted with their family members and who ask for this afterwards, maybe 2,000, 2,500 a year. But that process doesn't necessarily follow the same as the original refugee process. And that was a gap that the government noticed when they did this review. And so they have decided for now, those following to join applications will be halted until they can institute similar screening processes for those folks as they do for the refugees themselves. So that may mean that even people who are admitted as refugees may have to wait a little bit longer for their spouses or children to join them in the United States. And that does worry some refugee advocates because they may be themselves in vulnerable positions.
So going back to the distinction you guys were mentioning about how we're not in close proximity to the Middle East, what is the administration saying about why these rules are coming into effect?
What they're saying is the same thing they said in the travel bans earlier, that this is about security, it's about vetting. As I mentioned, they are concerned that terrorists and other nefarious organizations might be trying to use the refugee process to enter the United States. We don't have data that shows that is in fact the case, although those organizations have said they want to try to do so. We have no data that they have succeeded, but that is the issue that the administration is supposedly trying to address. And the issue really, I think, for a lot of people looking at this is how are we balancing these things? If there's not a lot of evidence that refugees create a significant threat stream to the United States, and yet we have these concerns about these threats, how do you balance the security of screening folks with the need and some would say the humanitarian impetus and necessity of protecting people who are in vulnerable positions? And I think that's where the crux of this gets. It's really about how long do you want to make people wait when you're eventually going to let them in. If there's not a serious threat condition, what are we doing?
Cris, how are refugee advocates reacting to this news?
They're not happy, obviously, as is expected. I think the extension, as Theresa was talking about, the extension really will make them wait a lot longer, especially for individuals from these 11 countries. And it goes back to the balance between sort of security concerns and humanitarians, and obviously advocates are weighing in heavily on the humanitarian concern that you have individuals waiting 18 to 24 months already. And
they're in vulnerable situations in
absolutely.
their own countries.
Yeah, I mean, the thing is, or, they're in UNHCR camps, where they're waiting for them to be able to move to the U.S. if they're not able to move to other countries, the receiving countries. So the advocates have been saying that this is something that they're not happy with because of the extension of time.
So let's zoom out a little bit. It seems every day we see news about another legal challenge to one of the Trump administration's immigration efforts. And Theresa, you mentioned kind of at the top of this segment about probably the most high-profile legal challenge, which is around the travel ban. Where does that stand today? There's been some movement on that in the last the last week or so.
Yeah, so you may remember that a week or so ago, the Supreme Court ended the first of the travel ban cases because the administration had put out its new travel ban 3.0 in September. And the Supreme Court said that rendered the original travel ban case moot. In other words, the original court case was based on the original travel ban. That travel ban was no longer in operation, so the court wouldn't decide. It vacated the lower court decision granting an injunction against it, which means that lower court decision is as if it never happened. So it basically wiped away that case. The Supreme Court yesterday, in light of the new refugee rules, did the same with the refugee piece of that court case. So the Supreme Court now has none of the travel ban cases pending before it. However, we're in round 3 of this match right now because advocates have sued over the third travel ban in courts across the country. And we've had 2 district courts, one in Hawaii, one in Maryland, the same 2 courts that rendered the original decisions that went up to the Supreme Court, and they have now enjoined travel ban 3.0. So now it's looking like it will make its way back up to the Supreme Court one more time. The major difference this time that will probably force the Supreme Court to address these issues finally is that there's no time limit on these latest declarations, right? So
those 90-day windows were making it hard to get through the whole process.
Yeah, those 90-day, 120-day windows, the temporary nature, quote unquote, of the original orders, that's no longer the case. These are now the permanent new process of the United States government in these 2 proclamations on visa holders and refugees. So these cases will move forward. And just to go back to the way beginning, when we first started talking about these, the issues in the court cases are constitutional issues. In particular, the Maryland court, which issued the most recent decision on the third travel ban, has said that the primary issue is whether or not these constitute anti-Muslim proclamations, and that falls under the Establishment Clause of the Constitution, that the government can't show favoritism or disfavoritism to any religion. So that is the piece on which the Maryland court hung its decision to enjoin on a nationwide basis this third travel ban. They made a slight exception. They said that the injunction only applies to people who have a connection to the United States. That's going back to the original Supreme Court decision earlier. So if you're somebody who's never been to the United States, doesn't have any connections here, you may still be prevented from travel under these third travel bans. But for anybody who has a U.S. sponsor, who has a relative here, or somebody, even the refugee case, the refugee settling agencies are saying that they haven't joined. So we're going to be back through this round again.
But we might actually get a final answer this time.
I think we will probably get a final answer this time. As Anna said, it's not a temporary ban anymore. It's now the permanent situation. And maybe the court will finally get to rule on the merits of all of these issues.
Cris, another issue area that's generating a lot of litigation is the issue of sanctuary cities. So what are those cases sort of about, and what's going on with them right now?
Right. So I think the source of these cases really revolves around sanctuary cities or sanctuary jurisdictions and the way the administration has been targeting them over this past year with threats about withholding funding. Now, why are they saying we're going to withhold funding? They're saying that these jurisdictions, first of all, should be complying with detainer requests that ICE issues for individuals who are held in local county jails that they want to take in, and also information sharing under current immigration law, where their interpretation of this law states that they have to collect, maintain, and then share information, whereas individuals in sanctuary cities are saying that's not the case. We can maintain information, but we don't have to gather it. Mm-hmm. And so what you've been seeing is that the administration has been adopting policies. One was an executive order that was issued around January and February that said basically we're going to strip all sanctuary jurisdictions of federal funding if you don't comply with issues related to information sharing with ICE detainers. And that was struck down. Basically there was the counties of San Francisco and Santa Clara sued them, and the court that oversaw this basically stated that they have a right to sue, and they're in the right because basically in their interpretation of the Constitution, Congress is the only body that can basically establish conditions for withholding federal funds, not the administration. So you have that component. You can say that there was a sequel that came out, this summer when the DOJ issued basically another policy that said we're going to withhold other types of funding, specifically the Byrne Memorial Justice Assistant Grant Program, from these sanctuary jurisdictions for essentially similar reasons related to information sharing and ICE detainers. Chicago sued the Department of Justice in August for similar reasons as the first lawsuit, and the Northern District of Illinois basically issued a ruling in support of the city of Chicago for the same reasons, that essentially only Congress can establish conditions on federal funding. The administration can't do that. So it's sort of a continuum of the same type of legal issues that you're seeing here.
Finally, Theresa, was in the news a lot last week, the case of Jane Doe in Texas. She is an unaccompanied minor who was picked up at the border and was being held at a detention facility in Brownsville, and she was seeking access to an abortion. Obviously, it's primarily an abortion case, which we're not going to get into here, but the case also did raise a few really interesting questions that have broader implications for immigration policy. Can you walk me through that aspect of this a little bit?
Sure. So what was interesting about this case, aside from the situation of this particular individual, is that the government was making an argument that this individual, by dint of being an undocumented immigrant and being in detention, wasn't necessarily subject to the same rights as others in the country. And so the overarching question, which frankly the court in issuing its final ruling recently didn't address, was what are the constitutional rights of undocumented immigrants in the United States? Does it matter that this person had literally been picked up just a few weeks before, that she hadn't resided in the United States, she hadn't come in the United States? Would it be different for someone who had been in the United States for a long time, had been arrested by ICE, for example, and put in detention? Would there be a different situation there? That would have been a very interesting immigration-related decision for the courts to undertake. They didn't in this case. It really evolved around sort of what are the government's obligation to facilitate an abortion, regardless of who it is. So I think that there's still a place for that judicial review to take place at some point. It may not happen in this case. Bigger issue, I think, is in light of all of these cases that you're seeing. It's been a while since the federal courts have been this engaged in such high-level immigration-related fights. A lot of our federal courts have been filled with immigration cases for a very long time, but most of them have been individuals asking about their individual situations, looking at whether or not this or that conviction for this or that crime really is a ground for removal in their case. They've had precedent, but they haven't had such high overarching application. We're now getting court cases, the travel ban, the sanctuary cities ban, this case, which are really addressing constitutional issues around the how broad the enforcement ability is of the executive branch of the government versus Congress. What is the relationship on immigration enforcement between the federal government and the cities and the states? What are the rights of immigrants in this country as opposed to citizens and others or undocumented immigrants in this country? These are really important judicial matters that have a heavy impact on the politics of immigration as well.
Yeah, so what accounts for this kind of change in what we're seeing in the courts?
Well, some of it is President Trump. He started his administration by pushing out executive orders that frankly pushed the envelope on a lot of these issues, and advocates pushed back strongly in the way they knew how in the courts.
Yeah, and I think it's the policy and the number of policies being generated. Obviously, there was Arizona SB 1070, which was passed, in this past decade, and there was obviously a Supreme Court ruling on the separation of powers for immigration enforcement. But that was really coming from one state generating one policy, and right now we're seeing the administration generating a large volume of policies that courts have to respond to.
And just to clarify, Arizona SB 1070 was about who has responsibility for enforcing federal immigration law, correct?
Exactly.
It was. And the court case was filed by the Obama administration arguing that the federal government had preemption over any state laws. Trump is trying to turn that a little bit on the head, as we discussed with the sanctuary city, saying, yes, we have federal preemption over state and local laws that are welcoming to immigrants, as opposed to Arizona's SB 1070, which was about immigration enforcement against immigrants. So the same arguments being used in the other direction, and the advocates are all pushing back against the federal government authority.
So for all of you who are deeply interested in immigration policy, this must be a fascinating time, as we're going to get some answers to some really fundamental questions.
We may, but the court process usually takes a long time, so it'll be definitely several months before we have answers from the Supreme Court for all of these.
Of course,
and we'll see what the answers are, and not everybody will probably like how they come out.
Well, thanks, Theresa. Thanks, Cris. And thanks again to Laura Hall from BPCAction. And thanks finally to Gretchen Akins, the producer of this podcast. That's the show for this week. You can take a second to find us on Facebook by searching Bipartisan Policy Center. Or you can find us on Twitter. We're at BPC_bipartisan.
And don't forget to subscribe to this podcast, as well as all of BPC's podcasts on iTunes by searching Bipartisan Policy Center. Join us again next time.